So one of the things I get asked a lot is how will trees grow in a warmer climate? Our higher elevation forests will actually grow faster because they're limited by the amount of energy they get. So if we have longer summers, less snowpack, they're actually going to do just fine, probably do better. Our mid-elevation forests, it's a little bit hard to tell. It's going to depend on how much precipitation changes in the future. Our low elevation forests are almost certainly going to grow slower. Those are the ones that will be most affected by drought in the future. So those will be some negative impacts. And so you see here there's winners and losers. I think a lot of the climate change discussions, including in science, tend to be all about bad things. But nature is kind of value neutral, right? It just takes things as they come. So there'll be some winners and losers. Another question I often get is, well, how will trees regenerate in a warmer climate? What's going to happen? Will it continue to generate and grow? And, okay, we've done a lot of research on this too, and we can tell you that in some of our high elevation forests, we're going to get increased regeneration. We already see that going on. A lot of these meadows are filling in very rapidly due to recent warmer temperatures. And we also know that in some of our drier forests, especially on the east side of the Cascades, they're going to be very stressed. It's going to be very challenging for them to regenerate in a climate that has more droughts. So these are very interesting scientific questions. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time on these during my career, but they pale in comparison to the effects of ecological disturbance on forest ecosystems. And that's mostly what I'd like to talk about today, because these are the things that have impacts on systems quickly and at very large spatial scales. We may be on the cusp of some of these things starting to occur now. So I like to look at some other fields for lessons. It seems like natural resource science is usually behind some of the other disciplines in science, and one of my favorite topics is geomorphology. And one of my friends and colleagues who's now passed, a fellow by the name of Ray Daniels, and he talked about the geomorphic development of landscapes in this way. He says this is not a uniform process. It's steady by jerks. So you have this real gradual background change, but then you get sudden changes, things like massive landslides, volcanoes. These are the things that affect our landscapes, big events. The same thing tends to be true in forest ecosystems. Now this is why I have this title. I decided not to open with my title slide because I didn't want you to think I was talking about people. So steady by jerks is a context for looking at ecosystem change in the future. So we're into the last third of 2013, but does anyone remember 2012? Especially the folks who maybe weren't in the Northwest, but maybe some of our friends from the Northeast. 2012 had this unprecedented drought, right? Remember that was in the paper for weeks. Warmest year since 1895. The most fire that we've ever measured since 1916. So some real extremes were going on in 2012. It was kind of a wake-up call in a way. Agriculture, I think 80% of all agriculture had lower yields. It affected the gross domestic product of the U.S. So this was an extreme event. These are the things that people pay attention to, not the 1 to 2 degree change in temperature, but the outcomes of those that may occur infrequently but have a lot of influence. I like to illustrate this with a good old probability curve like this, where we have our standard deviations down here in the corners of the curve. And so we can, on the y-axis there, we can put fire or flooding or whatever we want to do. But the point here is that if we change the mean, which is right here, just a little bit, it really changes the extremes. So something that maybe used to be a 1 in 40 year event now becomes a 1 in 6 year event. So if you're talking about fire, insect attacks, flooding, landslides, whatever it is, that's a huge change. And so that's why I'm so focused on this edge of the curve rather than on this part of the curve up here. That's mostly what my talk will be about today. Also, thresholds are extremely important. So we always have this climatic variability going on over time. Always have, always will. But when we get a directional change, we may get these occasional excursions above some critical threshold, but now we may be above that threshold for a long time. That might be something to do with tree growth, tree regeneration, insects, fire, flooding, all those things. But the thresholds, again, are the things that change the functionality of ecosystems. One of the things that can change is whether trees live or die. The poster child in forest ecosystem world have been the woodlands of the American Southwest, particularly the pinyon pine juniper forests in New Mexico. Has anybody been in this landscape at all? Good, okay. So this is an area that experienced about a good decade of drought between the 1990s and early 2000s. This is what it looked like in October 2002. This is what it looked like a year and a half later. Every pinyon pine in that area was dead. You see some green stuff there, which is all the junipers, but the pinyon pine at this portion were dead, and that was because they just couldn't put up with so little water for so long. And sometimes beetles came in and attacked them. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is a threshold that was exceeded. Whether or not this is sort of a window into the future for other locations, we don't know yet, but it's the kind of thing that had not been documented, at least within our lifetimes. So it could be a little bit of a warning sign. It was about, I think about 1.5 million acres. The die-off was mostly at low elevation and mostly at the margin of the distribution of this species. So the higher elevation stuff, the woodlands more towards the center were not as badly affected. But that's exactly what you'd expect, right? These are trees literally on the edge of where they can exist. So that's where you'd expect the first effects to occur.
Is it coming back?
In many cases, these pinyon pines are germinating and reestablishing. There are some areas now that have since burned, if you've heard some of the big fires in New Mexico and Arizona, where the regeneration is very sparse. And it remains to be seen if and when they will come back. Some people think they won't, but we'll see. Of all disturbance factors in the western North America, insects are the most important in terms of the amount of area that they cover. And our favorite critter here is the mountain pine beetle. That is not the actual size. I hope you realize that. But it's been a big story, big ecological story in the last decade in western North America. And we have a couple things happening here. First of all, across the west, we have forests that are old and somewhat stressed, particularly lodgepole pine, some cases ponderosa pine. Lodgepole pine is the favorite food of this critter. The second thing we have is that this critter has increased its reproductive rate. Normally it takes 2 years, now it takes 1 year. And in the winters, we aren't killing off the larvae in the trees anymore. So this thing has been basically released from its limitations, it's exceeded a threshold, and now it's free to attack all these stressed trees. This is up along the North Cascade Highway in Washington. My wife and I drove all the way across the northern edge recently, and there was not anywhere along that drive where you couldn't see dead trees from insects. Every single mile had some, not just pine beetle, but other insects as well. So this is becoming a pervasive influence across the West. Just a little bit of data. This is from the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, which is on the east side of the Cascades in Washington. And we can see that things really got ramped up here around 2000, and boom, big outbreak of insects. And once they get rolling, they can attack not only stressed trees, but healthy trees, once you get a big enough population of beetles. And here's a little graph that is for the entire western U.S. The orangish, reddish colors are areas where beetles have been documented to cause mortality. It was up to about 8+ million acres, probably up to 9 million acres or so. And you can see this little blip down here where it goes down in 2011, big drop. So the speculation is they're running out of food. They've done such a good job killing stressed trees that now they've reached their own population threshold that they need more trees to eat. So that may actually be dropping down a little bit. So this is a significant change across a large area of ecosystems in the Intermountain West. But this is nothing compared to what's been experienced in British Columbia. So this is going to go through a graph of observed mortality year by year, and you can see the little red dots come up there. And we'll just go all the way through this. Now we're getting up into the projected spread of beetles on up to the year 2020. Okay, so today in 2013, approximately 30 million acres of lodgepole pine have been killed in British Columbia. 30 million acres, that's like 15 Yellowstone National Parks contiguous. That's a big landscape. That's an enormous change in forest ecosystems over a short period of time. And it will take a long time for that landscape to return to some other sustainable form in the future. And it's unclear how fast that will occur and what form it will take. But these are big changes in ecosystems. Okay, let's go to the next disturbance topic, one of my favorite topics. I've been doing research on this for 30-some years. And we want to know, how can we establish this relationship between climate change and wildfire? And just to get us kicked off, has anybody ever heard this statement in a meeting or read it somewhere? Yes? Or a variation of that statement? Climate change is causing this? Okay, I hear it all the time. In scientific meetings, I read it all over the place. And since I'm fortunate enough to have a group of media folks here, I had to use my favorite quote, which is this. This pervades all of science, probably pervades all disciplines, really, to a certain extent. And I should probably end up down here saying meetings or blogs or whatever, but this is how things sometimes become fixed in people's minds. They hear it from someone whom they think is credible, is a good scientist, or they trust their opinion, and then that becomes a fact. But I would encourage you all to be very skeptical and to be very observant about the sources of information and the facts that are used by scientists to back up their opinions, because, believe it or not, scientists also have frailties and personal biases. I know that's hard to believe, but I found that to be very true. And so I think this is a topic that deserves some skepticism. I'd like to go through a couple things, and then you can tell me what you think of my perspective on this. Has anybody heard of this Pacific Decadal Oscillation? Anybody? Okay, so it's kind of like El Nino on steroids. El Nino is a 3 to 7 year warm, dry cycle. Pacific Decadal Oscillation is about a 25 to 35 year cycle of warm, dry periods of time. And so you can see here these warmer and cooler periods with some, well, actually quite a bit of variation over time. But in general, this has been a very helpful tool for us to look at longer term variation in climate over the years. Okay, keep that in mind if you would. Now I'm going to show you a figure that is the area burned by year for the western United States on federal lands. And you can see this pattern of high fire in the early 20th century, low in the middle, and then the latter part of the 20th into the 21st century is high again. And this is usually explained in this way. This was prior to significant settlement by people in the West. Then we got really good at putting fires out, and now the climate is warming, so we're getting more fires, and we got all those fuels to burn up when we were busy putting fires out. So that's possible. Another thing is also possible, and that is that climatic variability may be causing most of this pattern. So I superimposed the warm and cool phases of climate, of PDO, across this, and I don't really believe in coincidences too much. I think this is a pretty darn good correlation. Now, we are arguably moving into a cool PDO. Is that right, Ingrid?
Apparently, that's
okay.
what scientists say.
Okay. And we know they're right. Statement made at meeting, right there. But it does look like, from the data, that we may be moving into a cool period now in the future, and if we're able to sustain this high area burn, then we'll have something to talk about. Because if we can keep all these trees burning in a cooler climate, that will probably be a good climate change signal. But what we can say here, and this is the thing I want to stress, is that we have some predictability about if the future looks more like if the future looks like a warm PDO, then we know we're going to have more area burned. And that's not rocket science, right? I mean, if it's going to get warmer, drier, we're going to get more fire. But we can also quantify that. And in fact, we've done some of that. Another colleague has taken that same data set and projected what the West would look like by the year 2050 if we have about a 1 degree centigrade increase over where we are right now. And this is what it looks like. The more red it is, the more fire it is. Don't worry too much about the precision of these squiggly patches here. But do remember this. In the future, we'll probably have 2 to 3 times more area burned in the West than we do now. Again, these are extreme events. These are the things that change ecosystems rapidly. So this is probably what the future looks like about the middle part of the century. This is something called a disease spiral that was developed by a forest pathologist. And I like to apply it to the situation I'm going to talk about next, which is that rarely do trees die because of one thing alone. Usually it's an accumulation of stressors. So it might be climate change, it might be something that's occurring that's stressing a tree physiologically, it could be drought, and then if you get enough of those adding up, the tree dies. It's the same for animals, same for us. It's usually accumulated stresses that cause disease and death. And I call these things stress complexes. So it's not just fire, it's not just insects, it's not just plant pathogens, it's all these things together that can have this final effect on a system. And kind of the best example in the West is mixed conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada. These are forests that are inherently stressed by things like air pollution, and we've done a good job on keeping fire out of there, and they're subject to different extended drought periods and insects and so forth. And here's what that looks like diagrammatically. Don't worry too much about all the arrows and so forth. I'm just going to run you through the highlights. So a warmer climate can kick off this sequence of events: higher temperatures, more ozone, which is toxic to ponderosa pine, bark beetles, more tree mortality, more big fires because we now have more fuels on the ground, and then ultimately you might have some real big changes in these systems, different tree species, for example, or exotic species coming in. So this is just to show you the complexity of these interactions. Not just fire, not just insects, but this whole complex of stressors. So given this sounds kind of grim, but are there some things that we can do to deal with these extreme events? Basically, how do we make these systems more resilient in terms of how we manage them in the future? This is a photo of the tripod fire, which occurred in 2006 on the eastern slopes of the Washington Cascades. It's the largest fire we've had in Washington to date. And it's been suggested that in a lot of our dry forest ecosystems that we could do a better job of moving them from this sort of condition with high densities and high fuels to lower densities and low fuels. This kind of a landscape here will facilitate fire movement through there as it used to behave prior to about 1900, where they'd burn every 3 to 20 years approximately, basically frequent low-intensity fires. Those will not kill the overstory. And this is more than just hypothetical. We have good empirical data on this. One of my students did a great study on this topic, and she looked at areas where the fuels had been treated before the fire and had not been treated. Areas that did not have any treatment, it was pretty much 100% mortality. Areas that had been treated, anywhere from 80 to 90% of the trees survived. Most of these trees can tolerate a fair amount of crown damage and they'll still live through the fire. So this is an example of active management increasing the resilience of this forest to fire. And this is a very common thing that's done throughout the West. This is predominantly a technique that you would use for lower to mid elevation, mixed conifer forest dominated by ponderosa pine. Douglas fir, and western larch. So if you get up to higher elevations, species like lodgepole pine, subalpine fir, those species are much more sensitive to fire. And they will tend to die if you light a match in the area. So yeah, this is a technique that's designed more for those lower elevation dry forest systems. Now, we also have another interesting example from this same fire in 2006. This is at higher elevation. And you can see this patchwork here, mostly of 100% mortality across the landscape. But we also see some green patches here and there. Those green patches, the surviving trees, happen to be areas that were clear-cut about 20 years ago. So, in a way, these areas that were harvested are now a source of biodiversity for this particular location. Now, I talked about this recently at a Sierra Club meeting, so I had to throw in this quote, is forest harvest a tool for building resilience? Just to get their attention. But the point here is that if you have a mosaic of conditions, that particular system is more likely to survive into the future. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't have all your lodgepole pine 100 years old. Have them different age classes so that if you get insects, fire, whatever, something's bound to survive if it's in a different structure or a different age class. So that's what this is all about. And the challenge here is not to manage acre by acre or 100 acres by 100 acres, but to manage by hundreds of thousands of acres. Look at entire landscapes and figure out what mosaic of structures and age classes might confer resilience, provide the kinds of values you want, whether it's timber, water, wildlife, whatever. And so you need a sustainable approach to this. But again, the one species, one age class doesn't generally work very well. So we need to rethink that. We are trying to move forward in federal agencies. I work for the U.S. Forest Service, and we recently published this adaptation guidebook for national forests. And we suggest some processes and techniques that can be used to confer this resilience on forest ecosystems. This isn't the only thing available, and we're early in the process of trying to do this adaptation process across western forests. And I'm going to suggest here a few things that we can do. These are going to be strategic things, not necessarily on-the-ground implementation. Some will be. But basically to suggest there's some things we can do differently that will help us. The first one is the one I just alluded to, increasing our landscape diversity. So we want to move more from older, dense stands in some of our dry forests on the left to more open stands, lower fuels, and so forth. This does a couple things. First of all, it increases the vigor of those trees, the remaining trees, so that they'll be more resistant to drought, more resistant to insects, and then by having lower fuels, then fires can move through this area. You're not going to stop fires. Nobody stops fires, but you can reduce the severity of the fire when it occurs. And it is when it occurs. It's not if, it's when. And big fires cannot be stopped, as we've seen in the Rim Fire in California recently. So you're going to get these fires in the future. So this is one way to do it, and greater diversity in species often helps as well. The second one, this is kind of the the mom and apple pie thing, is increased biological diversity. So who could be against that, right? But what this looks like on the ground is maybe diversifying our species mixes a bit when we plant trees. Don't just plant monocultures, which are much more susceptible to disease. And to plant different genotypes. Genotypes are different genetic varieties. For years, scientists have been telling forest managers, plant trees that come from the stock where you live, because they'll be best adapted. And that's been like Bible verse practically. Now we're saying, well, we're going to rethink that a little bit and create some diversity of your planting stocks. So plant trees that are a little bit farther, from seeds a little farther south, a little farther down the hill, with the presumption that they'll be more drought tolerant. But the point is, again, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify your genetic composition of the forest. Increase this resilience at large spatial scales. We really have to work across landscapes at least as large as what we're looking at in the picture here. It won't do any good to do this thinning and fuel reduction in small patches of land. We have to do this across hundreds of thousands of acres because that's the scale of the disturbances that occur. So we have to match those. And then finally, we tend to think about or portray these big fires and insect attacks as disasters, catastrophes. I don't know how many of my colleagues refer to catastrophic fire. I just get this twitch every time I hear that term. And catastrophe, to whom and why? It's not a catastrophe necessarily to the organisms involved with it. But the point is here, from a human perspective, again, these fires will occur. So let's plan on what we're going to do after the fire. Rather than run around in circles and say, oh my, we've got this big fire, now what? We should know exactly what we're going to do the next time that big fire moves through the landscape. And the things being how they are these days, logistically and bureaucratically, it takes a long time to get management plans through the process to approval. So if we start it before the fire, we have a chance of implementing the plans quickly after the fire. So at this point, you may feel like there's a train coming down the tracks at you, or you may feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel. I prefer the latter because I have to be somewhat hopeful about this. I do think there are things we can do to modify some of the perceived negative things that could happen as a result of climate change to forests in the future. So I remain hopeful that's light at the end of the tunnel. Well, some of you have seen this, but I think it's such a good cartoon. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do in forest management that are good ideas anyway. And I call those no regrets strategies. Things that are good for the health of ecosystems, the sustainability and resilience of ecosystems, regardless of climate change. So let's go ahead and do those. And we'll have some benefits for the systems regardless of how severe climate change turns out to be in the future.